Over to you, Clay.
Thanks, Nabil. And thanks, Alex, for joining us. As Nabil mentioned, today we're going to review Alex's book, Out-Innovate, and we're going to discuss the many lessons one can learn by studying startup success outside of the traditional innovation hubs of Silicon Valley and New York City. Before we dive in there, though, I think it's really important to learn more a little bit about Alex, because he has a uniquely global perspective as an investor. And I think it really started in your early investing career, Alex, as part of the Multiplier network, and now as Cafe Innovation, which is a firm that's international by design. Maybe to start, could you share a little bit on your background and how you got into investing, and then how that led to the thought process of writing this book?
Yeah, happily. And thank you so much, Clay and Nabil, for having me and hosting the conversation. I've always been interested in the intersection of innovation, investing, and impact. And today I work for a VC fund called Cafe Innovation, globally focused fund, about 500 million euro fund two, a third invested in Asia, a third Europe, a third North America. We also have a Pan-Africa venture fund in partnership with African Invest, and the whole group is affiliated with Cafe Capital, a Paris-based private equity fund. And before that, I was at Multiplier Network, which is the family office venture fund of Pierre and Pamela Multiplier, investing in startups around the world with a financial inclusion lens. And in that work, I've always had one foot in the Valley and one foot supporting entrepreneurs wherever they were. Outside of work, I teach an MBA class at the Middlebury Institute for International Studies, which is Middlebury College's graduate program in Monterey. And this is in some ways the genesis of the book. I was getting really frustrated. A lot of my students were, like me. I grew up in the middle of Canada in Winnipeg, and many of my students were moving back home to wherever they were from, or many were actually moving to emerging markets or other countries to start their businesses. And I always felt like whenever I was assigning a book or sharing an article or any type of best practice on innovation, I always had to contextualize it with the reality of building startups in ecosystems that just look different than the Valley, that might not have the same amount of capital, that might not have the same depth of trained startup human capital, that might not have the same resources, or that just might be more susceptible to macroeconomic shocks. And in that context, I believe that the best entrepreneurs operating in Winnipeg or Kitchener-Waterloo or Amsterdam or Nairobi or Bangalore have more in common with the best entrepreneurs operating in Sao Paulo than they do operating with those in San Francisco. And in many ways, the best entrepreneurs among them are not only challenging some of these conventional wisdoms, increasingly they're reinventing the playbook altogether. And so that had been the genesis of the book. And I ended up interviewing about 200 entrepreneurs from around the world. These are mostly folks that are leading a couple $100 million to a couple $1 billion businesses or have exited. And I think taking together their best practices and approaches give us an opportunity to revisit the playbook, and in many ways, I think reinvent it. And that's the genesis of the book today.
Great. I love that your title is Out-Innovate, which innovate being the operative word, as opposed to a lot of the buzzwords we hear in Silicon Valley is disruption or, category definition, if you will. And for decades, Silicon Valley has written the playbook on innovation, like you mentioned. But the reality of it is the rule books are changing, the rules are changing. And we're seeing this really happen at an incredible pace now. Why is global innovation happening at now versus 10, 20, 30 years ago? And why is the pace seem to be increasing versus where we were historically?
Yeah, I'm incredibly bullish about the future of entrepreneurship globally. And obviously the story of entrepreneurship is not new, but I think what's happening right now, this phenomenon of technology-driven entrepreneurship is accelerating around the world for a bunch of reasons. I think one, it's never been easier to start a business wherever you are. Services like Amazon Web Services let you rent a supercomputer by the hour rather than having to build your servers yourself. But that extends to everything like Canada's Shopify, making it easier for anyone to launch an e-commerce startup. But also the culture of entrepreneurship has really been exported. It's now at the top of policy agendas of countries worldwide. And while VC capital is still highly concentrated in a couple of zones, that's changing. and we're starting to see more access to financial services, to financial capital around the world. And so I think those are tailwinds. And I think it's manifesting itself in the data. And today, the largest digital bank in the world is in Brazil. The largest robotic process automation company started in Romania, UiPath. The biggest super apps in the world are in China. And so we're seeing some of the most successful companies getting built everywhere. And there are around 480 startup ecosystems around the world, over 1 million venture funds already in emerging markets, which is, if you think of some of the more frontier markets in the world, 10% of the world's billion-dollar businesses are getting built there. And so we're seeing a big tectonic shift where not only is it easier to start companies, but I also think we are seeing an acceleration of success and scale of those same businesses.
You mentioned in the book that a lot of the companies that you've studied were really born global as a necessity, not as a choice. Can you talk a little bit more about that theme and why are more companies taking a multi-market approach from day one versus starting small and then scaling?
If I was going to even take a step back on the book, one of the meta themes in the book is having to do more with less. It's operating in ecosystems where there's less capital, there's less resources, what have you. One of those manifestations is this notion of operating perhaps in smaller markets. If you're an entrepreneur in Singapore or in Estonia or in Israel or where have you, the local TAM is smaller. And as a result, the best entrepreneurs figure out a way to be born global, to target multi-markets from day one, to build an organization, a product, a culture that can scale across borders. I think there's obviously a couple of reasons for that. The first is TAM, as I mentioned, right? And the necessity to be able to target a sufficient base of customers across a variety of reasons. I think there's a couple others though. I think second, the ability to learn and learning from and adapting your product to different markets forces adaptation, which then helps improve the original. I think third, there's a little bit of the best defense is a strong offense kind of play, where by being born global, entrepreneurs are able to put a stake in the ground in different ecosystems. And that is also a defensive position because the world of innovation is global today. And if you don't go global, others will come to you. And so it's actually really important. I alluded to the story of UiPath earlier in Romania. I think that's a really pertinent example here. I interviewed Daniel Dines, the founder, and he talked a lot about the fact that having started in Romania and from the beginning having to think about building a product, a culture, an organization that could adapt to different countries, languages, organizational constructs, etc., was really critical to his road to success. And I think, consistent to the name of Out-Innovating, I think is a really good example. They are the most successful RPA company in the world. They're beating, certainly by market cap, some of the Silicon Valley and other global competitors. They're rumored to be out right now at a $10 billion market cap. And so we're seeing this play out as a strategy of a reaction towards adversity in some ways, but actually a strategy for success in the end.
I love that example, and you mentioned as well, and I think there's a couple examples in your book, but there's a chapter dedicated to the fact that being resourceful also applies to building your teams and taking really a multi-market approach in building your teams. Obviously we're still in the midst of the coronavirus pandemic, and a lot of companies have gone through a pretty dramatic transformation over the last couple of months, going from where they might have been, testing out the waters of remote teams, maybe beginning to plan for it, to now fully thrust into distributed operations. Can you point to some examples of the kind of what you've seen work with some of the innovators outside of Silicon Valley from a team building perspective and from a kind of org structure perspective? And are there any themes that we should take away from those?
Yeah, and I think the distributed piece is so critical. Obviously, what we're all going through right now in the world is not normal, right? It is not normal to be working remote in the context of a looming recession, a global pandemic, and no schools and having to take care of your kids at home. That is not normal. But I do believe that this meta trend of moving towards more distributed workforces is coming, and we're seeing best practice of that emerge in emerging ecosystems of entrepreneurship around the world. First of all, just one reaction is that I actually think that people conflate distributed and remote a lot of time. There's actually a pretty big range of what it means to build a distributed organization and tapping talent from different places. One end of it might actually be fully remote and no head office, but another part of the spectrum might actually be you're going to have multi poles of the organization, or you might have an engineering team in different locations, et cetera. And so I think it's important to be cognizant of the fact that there's a range, and I suspect that as the world continues to evolve, we're going to see more and more mixed modality across all of that. But I also believe that being distributed is a powerful tool for many businesses. I think one is this ability to tap the world for talent. In Silicon Valley, there's obviously a big shortage of engineers and things like that. So it's now become in vogue to think about building distributed teams, but it's already been best practice in many startups ecosystems around the world. I'm from Winnipeg, and if I was building a startup and trying to hire a CMO, there aren't 500 CMOs that have been there, done that, scaled the startup there. There might not be 50. There might be some other order of magnitude smaller, and maybe they're already working with my competitors. And so by nature, I would think about finding the best talent I could wherever that person was, and building a team around them, et cetera. And so I think there's that element. I think two, I think it's a way to tap talent wherever they are, and in some ways potentially manage cost away from only being in the Valley. I think third, tied to this idea of building global organizations, building a distributed team is a strong way to build the muscle of building a born global team at the same time. If you build an ability to work across borders, across geographies, you can do it. And lastly, and I think particularly pertinent to the conversation today, is I think it's a strong tool to drive diversity as well in teams. Where if people are judged by the outputs of their work rather than the biases of what we think they look like in the workplace, I think we can drive better diversity. So that's something that I'm seeing more and more, to your question, Clay, in the shift towards distributed.
Yeah, absolutely. I think, once you remove that barrier of kind of location, you really do open up yourselves to multiple benefits of a much larger and global talent for workforce. And increasingly, that means better talent and more diversity and more diverse thoughts coming into the organization. You list a number of really great examples in your book. Two that kind of stood out were Cimpress and Zola, as companies that were distributed from the get-go, and really kind of continue to kind of further double down on that approach. And you have this concept of the triple threat, which is cross-pollination, being multi-market, and then also building distributed teams. Can you elaborate on kind of what the triple threat is, and why does that sort of lead to successful outcomes for companies like Cimpress and Zola?
Yeah, and in many ways, if I think of the book, I think a lot of the themes that I explore in the book it's more like a menu than a recipe book. It doesn't do A, B, C, and D, and you get to a successful outcome. It's much more take what resonates. Some of it will be applicable to your company or your geography, and some of it won't, and that's okay. And so this is one of those examples where you might choose to be born global because of the context that you operate in. You might choose to be distributed, but this notion of being the triple threat is there are a set of companies that are doing a couple of these things at the same time. I think one, they're cross-pollinating ideas. They're leveraging ideas and putting a bunch of them together from different geographies to build the business model. They're building a distributed team to put it together, and they're building a multi-market business model from the get-go. The Zola example that you mentioned, this is a off-grid solar energy business that started off in Tanzania. So there's about 1.2 billion people around the world that have no access to power. And instead they burn kerosene, literally jet fuel, to light their homes. That's obviously tied with a range of negative health outcomes, poor educational attainment, et cetera. What Zola did is they combined innovations that were happening in different pockets. Obviously solar panel and battery innovation that was happening in China and in the Valley, combined with mobile banking advances that are happening in East Africa that allowed the ability to receive very, very small payments in real time, combined with advanced credit scoring, and combined with remote monitoring and things like that, to combine a solution where it was pay-as-you-go solar and as little bits at a time, and it converted the high upfront costs into a payment that was similar to what these families were already paying with kerosene. So they combined a bunch of these insight, in part driven by the lived experience of the founders. One of them had managed a nonprofit before in East Africa. Another had founded a book and founded a startup in the used book space, and the third was a solar expert. To do it, they tapped resources from around the world. The kits came from Asia. They built a team in Amsterdam for operations. They built an R&D team in the Valley, tapping talent from Tesla and Solar City, and distribution in multiple countries across East and West Africa. And so they basically did all of these things together to build the startup and scale it. And so that's really what I'm talking about. And the Simpress story is similar in terms of combining a bunch of these elements to be able to set up an organization that was primed to scale and succeed. And we obviously know the Simpress story is a much more mature one, and we know the outcome there at scale already.
Great. You also talk about kind of the difference in mentality for a lot of the innovators outside of Silicon Valley. And one of the things that I think has gotten a lot of press and has been a really good sort of analogy has been kind of the idea of a startup being a camel as opposed to being a unicorn. Can you tell us what is a camel, and why do we find that more camels might be outside of the traditional innovation hubs?
Yeah, and well, let me first start by defining a unicorn in the usage. In many ways, a unicorn is both a startup that's worth over $1 billion, but in other ways, it's a philosophy, and it's an approach to building startups. And if the philosophy is that, the method is growth at any cost. It's a method where it's okay to subsidize user acquisition in service of growth, where it's okay to burn and accelerate that burn ahead of growth. It's okay to take a short-term lens on it. And in many parts of the world, and as a reaction to these ecosystems of adversity, I think the best entrepreneurs are weaving in sustainability and resilience into the business model from day one. And that's what I call building a camel, as my catchy catchphrase, perhaps. But it's this notion of starting with a business model where the unit economics are sustainable, where burn is built thoughtfully and taking a long-term approach. This doesn't mean don't grow. It obviously is the entrepreneurs I'm interviewing are focused on building successful scaled businesses, but doing it in this responsible way. I interviewed Mike Evans, the co-founder and COO of Grubhub, and he talked a lot about the fact that at every single fundraise, Grubhub was sustainable, and the fundraisers for very specific purposes, expand to another city or do a small acquisition or what have you, that they really took their time to scale, but were built with that organization, that philosophy in mind. I asked Mike, I said, look, like it took you about 10 years to IPO. You might have been able to do it faster. Why didn't you raise more capital and grow quicker? And he said, look, I could have done it in 2 less years if I'd raised more capital, but I would have done it at meaningfully more risk. And in many ways, that's what I'm talking about, is how do we get to these risk-adjusted outcomes of successful and scaled businesses more often? We often look to the unicorn story and say, hey, look, this company succeeded in this way, and therefore, let's look at the way that they got there. What we don't know is if you replay that story 10 times, how many of those times would we have gotten to the outcome that we are seeing this way? And I believe that taking this camel-like approach, you get to that outcome more reliably and more often. And that's really why I'm espousing this approach as a philosophy. And so that's the camel approach.
You mentioned also in your book, and I think it's related to that mindset, which is the concept of building an A team as opposed to hiring kind of A players. Can you talk about the difference there and what mindset is required for these innovators to be able to build the teams and be able to kind of get to the point where they are at the end of the journey that they're at the 8 level, if you will.
Yeah, and in many ways, I think of startups in the early days as an input of 3 things. Is obviously an idea, some amount of capital for certain businesses, and having the right team. And among a survey of founders in emerging markets, one of the things that I think is astounding is that as the companies scale, even in ecosystems with very little venture capital, the only one that becomes harder over time is people and building the team. And so this is really one of the big challenges universally for founders everywhere, is building and scaling a team when you have a business model that works. And I think this is an area where the best entrepreneurs have taken a philosophically different approach to what is conventional wisdom in the Valley. Like in the Valley, I think something that you hear people talk about is just hire only 8 players. And this is built in a construct where employee churn is built into the business model, right? Like Uber's average tenure is less than 15 months. And it's okay if people leave, because there's a unlimited well of incredible talent locally to replace them with, and that know those kinds of business models can kind of plug in reasonably quickly. And in many ecosystems around the world, I think the best entrepreneurs are taking this opposite approach of building an A team and taking a longer term view on their relationship. And so I think one is it starts with pipeline development and building your own pipeline. A story that I love in Canada is a story of what Shopify's been doing is around building their own pipeline in partnership with the University of Carleton with a dev degree, an engineering degree, to be able to build that. In Africa, I explore the hotels.ng. It's like, imagine a booking.com style platform that did a virtual internship over Slack to try to tap undiscovered talent anywhere. And that was their formal recruiting mechanism rather than asking for resumes. So it starts with thinking about that. There's some more nascent experiments happening on reinventing how to do compensation instead of just relying purely on stock options. And so how do you actually think about longer term alignment with entrepreneurs? One founder I interviewed talked a lot about a hybrid version of RSUs to set that up. But I think ultimately the bigger thing is taking this growth mindset to the employees that you have, and how do you actually get them to stay and give them an ecosystem and a career path and an opportunity to learn that has longevity built in. And this philosophical approach and a bunch of the tactics underneath there that I explore in the book, I think is a broad macro trend that we're seeing, and I hope continues to scale.
Yeah, it feels like there's almost a kind of a social good sort of component of a lot of these companies, at least in their formation, and then ultimately how they treat their employees and how they really kind of build that A team. Do you think that that's something that's happening more and more, maybe from your experiences at Meteor and now at Cafe? Are you seeing that happen more? And then I'd love to also dive into, are you seeing where there are new hubs that are popping up throughout the world, or are we just finding that the hub kind of concept of just Silicon Valley or in New York are just kind of coming down off the pedestal, if you will, and it's just going to be more broadly distributed?
So it's interesting. Let me tackle the first one around impact first, then we can talk about the hubs. On the first one, I think it's true. I think that philosophically, the problems that entrepreneurs are choosing to solve in different ecosystems look different. I think in the Valley, we're obsessed with this notion of disruption, of finding an industry that has a stodgy incumbent with an inefficient solution and tackling that with software and more efficiency and a new attitude. And that often yields great businesses. But in many emerging startup ecosystems, the best founders are instead choosing to tackle problems where I call them creators. They're tackling a problem where there's an underserved need that doesn't exist in the formal economy. They're offering it for the mass market. And often they are the shoulders of giants upon which others build after. They're really taking the ecosystem building role. There was a survey of billion-dollar businesses in the US, and less than 18% of them were focused on critical industries like financial services or education or agriculture or energy or healthcare. And yet in many emerging markets, the stats are reversed. I did an analysis, for instance, in sub-Saharan Africa, and it was well over 60%. And so obviously that's an extreme, but we're seeing much more of that attitude towards solving problems, building businesses where the impact is also tied inherently into the operations of the business. And as we come out of COVID, I actually am hopeful, and I believe that we're going to see more of that, where COVID is laying bare some of these massive challenges. And we will see, as an outcome of that, entrepreneurs that see those as opportunities and look to solve them. And so I definitely see that, Clay. And to your second question, just around startup ecosystems, I believe that places like Silicon Valley and New York and elsewhere are going to continue to be incredible hubs for innovation. But what I believe is also going to be true is that a range of other places will also become incredible hubs of innovation. And we will see a acceleration of that. And for Silicon Valley to stay relevant, I actually think it's important for it to avoid its, what I call the Detroit moment. Think back 100 years or less than that, actually, right? Detroit used to be on top of the world, and it was the capital of innovation and entrepreneurship. The technology of the day wasn't software, right? It was automobiles, and it was set to transform the world. And it had hundreds of startups in the car company. The top 3 in the world were there. What happened, right? Innovation went global. And today, the capital of sexy sports cars is perhaps in Italy, right? The best place for raw engineering and vehicles might be Germany. The most reliable cars are in Japan. And the best electric cars are in the Valley or perhaps Shenzhen. And with that, best practice has also gone global, like just-in-time manufacturing and things like that. And the very same thing might also happen to the Valley, where for it to stay relevant, I think it needs to learn from this best practice that's emerging all over the world. And we're seeing version 1, 2, 3 playing out now. This is going to continue to play out. I'm going to have to write a sequel, I'm sure, in a couple of years. It'll have to be much more nuanced. But I definitely think that the Valley is going to have its challenges, and it's going to have to figure out a way to stay relevant. But I think it has a great chance, and it obviously has an incredible ecosystem in so many ways. And so I remain bullish on the Valley, but I think it needs to learn from elsewhere as well.
Another point you make in the book is about the concept of kind of like what you call older siblings, which is really the kind of the concept of innovation happening in a different market where perhaps the leadership team has exposure to Silicon Valley or typical innovation hubs and are bringing that into the market. And as you mentioned, maybe for Silicon Valley to remain relevant in the new world, we're going to have a reverse of that older sibling sort of mentality. But I'm curious, can you give some examples of where you've seen that older sibling sort of concept really play out? And I'd love to hear if you think there's any examples of where we're seeing it already coming back to Silicon Valley into any forward thinking companies that are here.
Yeah, happily. And I think this is really this notion that entrepreneurial ecosystems don't just pop up in a vacuum, right? You can have a bunch of these ingredients like capital or great universities or a network of ideas or corporates, et cetera. But that alone will not create a startup ecosystem. And a lot of people have written about this notion of the role of entrepreneurs in building startups. And in the book, I talk first about how many of the best founders in these emerging ecosystems are taking a role in building some of the core pieces of the culture. For instance, around building a culture of risk, I interviewed the organizers of Codename Fun. It's called Fuck Up Nights. It's the biggest distributed network entrepreneurial community to basically celebrate entrepreneurial failure and start the conversation. It started in Mexico and is now all over the world. So we're seeing entrepreneurs build those things for their communities. But what we're also seeing, and I think this is the bit that's underappreciated about startup ecosystem development, is actually the role of scaled companies. And this is really what I'm talking about for these older siblings, are entrepreneurs that have successfully scaled their business, exited, and in so doing have trained a set of folks in how to build a fast-growing startup in that ecosystem, have minted a bunch of angel investors, and have also become role models in their ecosystem. And those folks are often actively coming back and supporting the ecosystem themselves. Endeavor, the global nonprofit and ecosystem builder, talks about the multiplier effect. And it's really linked to that, the multiplier effect of some of these scaled businesses. And when I did the analysis, if you actually look at ecosystem, you said, what is the number of billion-dollar businesses that have been created? And you were going to plot them. You say, well, maybe the first year there's one, a couple of years later there might be a second one, a couple of years later there might be a third. There's a certain inflection point when you get to kind of 4 to 6, and all of a sudden it then starts to accelerate. And so there's some amount of having not just one or two of these older siblings, but having some critical mass that helps to unlock the ecosystem. And Clay, to your point around this notion, in many ways the value is built in the same way. This is not something that's new to building startup ecosystems in more nascent startup ecosystems, nascent places. This also played out in the Valley, right? Think of the story of Fairchild Semiconductor and the number of startups that are linked to that in the Valley, or more recently the PayPal mafia and how that unlocked it. There's a bunch of these other kind of stories like that where we're seeing a set of founders and businesses really unlock new pockets of innovation in the industry. And so I think that's going to be one of the critical elements to continuing to build out and scale startup ecosystems around the world.
Great. We're going to switch gears just a little bit here, Alex, and we're going to now talk a little bit more about kind of the areas of investment in that where you're focused and what you're excited about. But the first question I have is, which is more difficult, breaking into investing, becoming a venture capitalist, or becoming a published author?
I don't know. I've had the really, really good fortune of becoming an accidental venture capitalist, and I think I'm also an accidental author. I'm an accidental venture capitalist in the sense that I've always been interested in this intersection of innovation, impact, and questions of finance. When I was at McKinsey before Omidyar Network, I had been really interested in these notions of financial inclusion and got connected with the Omidyar Network that was building out a fintech financial inclusion venture team. And so that kind of transition happened a little bit accidentally. And the other accidental transition happened to writing a book was I'd been thinking about these ideas, and my wife, who's an attorney, had taken a sabbatical and started writing a fiction novel. And to keep her company, I actually wrote an essay, a 5,000-word essay, which I thought, maybe I'll write this as Medium post or something like that, but just to scratch the itch. And I submitted to this contest called the Brackenbauer, which is hosted by McKinsey and the Financial Times. It's the little brother of the Book of the Year Prize, and mine shockingly became selected one of the top 3 of these new ideas in business. And so I ended up getting approached and got a book deal. And so I don't have a great answer for you, but I'm happy for folks that want advice on how to do each. I'm happy to talk more about that too.
Great. So Alex, what areas are you most excited about going forward in terms of investment and really in development in the next, let's say, decade?
Yeah, as a macro theme, I think life's too short. I'm really focused on supporting entrepreneurs that are really, to use the language of the book, creators that want to build an industry and really shape how things will evolve over time. I was delighted to partner with you, Clay, and the rest of the team. And I think Terminal has an incredible role in building the distributed teams, distributed organization ecosystem in North America and around the world. But I think that is the type of entrepreneurs and businesses that I enjoy partnering with. I'm personally really focused on 3 sectors, which is future of work, healthcare, and financial services. And so that's where I'm going to continue spending most of my time going forward.
Great. And we're starting to get some questions coming in now from the audience. The first one, Alex, is what are your thoughts on the H-1B visa suspension today and what that will mean for American innovators and innovators around the world?
Yeah, I think it is undeniable the importance of immigrants in the role of innovation in the US and around the world. In the book, I talk about this idea of cross-pollinators. And many of the best innovators are people that are connecting the dots from different industries, that are taking their lived experience and combining it with other ideas and bringing capital and people from different buckets. And their role in building and launching some of the most successful companies. Immigrants are the quintessential cross-pollinators. And in the US, I don't remember the statistic, but it's the vast majority of the most successful unicorns have immigrant founders or immigrants within the exec team. The rate of immigrants founding businesses greatly outpaces the rate of non-immigrants, right? And so all these statistics are undeniable. There's an incredible, there are incredible pockets where we cannot find candidates. And I read a tweet today, and I don't remember who said it, but imagine a baseball team that could only recruit players from its own town and was competing with a baseball team that recruit players from anywhere around the world. Like, who do you think would win? And in many ways, I think that it's critical for us to be able to tap the best people from wherever they are to succeed. And so, my view on this, really, I talk about it in the book, and I think it's pretty evident. And I think that some countries are being incredibly thoughtful around building innovation ecosystems, and I think Canada, for instance, with its own approach, or the entrepreneurial visa program, et cetera, I think is positioning itself well to continue scaling and building a local talent base and ecosystem and environment to foster innovation. And so I think it's critical going forward.
Agreed. Next question is that the really the older siblings concept, the been there, done that professionals are so valuable. What can distributed teams do to access those more experienced sort of siblings, if you will?
Yeah. I think a lot of this, by the way, is relationship driven too. And so I think that it's important to build human relationships in whatever capacity that is. I think that you can do some of that in person, you can do some of that by Zoom, but I actually think a lot of this is an investment into time. And so I think that's kind of one, if you are a founder of a business and you're trying to build your network, et cetera, I would think about it in with this individual relationship perspective. But as an ecosystem builder, I think that this notion of distributed teams and this notion of supporting your local ecosystem can coexist very strongly, where you're still trying to figure out how do you make your local ecosystem one of the best places to found a business, to get other startups from other geographies to decide to build part of their hubs in your location. I think the two of them link together. I think Salt Lake City is a great example of that here in the US, where it has built Silicon Slopes, right? And an incredible thriving startup ecosystem and many very successful businesses. I profile the story of Qualtrics in the book, for instance, but also they've become one of the best places in the US for startups that want to build inside sales teams. And they put them there because that ecosystem has really built a strength around that. And so you're getting startups that are selling businesses that look like that and scaling businesses that look like that, but also developing expertise, et cetera. And so I think the two of those coexist, and older siblings could have a really strong role in that.
Great. Next question is, every investor has their one that got away story. For you, which one out on the frontier got away and you wish you were able to have made the investment in?
I'm sure I do not have only one. My list, I'm sure, is very long. But one that comes to mind is Nubank. I've been really focused on this question of using technological innovation to drive financial access of products and services. One of the founders that I interviewed for the book, but unfortunately didn't get a chance to invest in, was David Velez. He founded Nubank. It is a credit card for the mass market. At the beginning, kind of affordable credit in Brazil for the mass market. Today is the most valuable neobank in the world. And in many ways, in a market that had some of the highest interest rates in the world, David and the team at Nubank built a technologically driven solution that looks a little bit like what Capital One would have done in the US long before, of providing that I've spent a lot of time in the neobank space and really big believer in that sector, which has led me to invest in Chime Bank when I was at Omidyar Network, and in Bank Neon, another digital bank in Latin America and Brazil. But I'm such a huge fan of what David has built in Nubank and their model, and now they're in Mexico, one of these born global players as well.
Next question that came in, and this is from someone who's been studying your book. They were asking about the concept of full stack that you mentioned in Out-Innovate, and just ask you to elaborate a little bit more on kind of what full stack means in as you talk about kind of innovation on the frontier.
Yeah, in many ways, startups at the frontier have to do more with less, and this is another great example where in many startup ecosystems there's just less infrastructure and enabling infrastructure. So let me give you an example, which is a startup of Guilherme, coming back to Brazil. Guilherme is a personal finance manager. Think Mint.com for Brazil. Mint.com, when it launched in the US, built an app that allowed you to see all your accounts in one place. But they benefited from bank interconnection layers like Yodlee and today Plaid. They benefited from a credit scoring system that existed and that everyone was mostly covered, and a fintech ecosystem of people that are willing to pay money for leads to Mint.com. In Brazil, none of those things existed, right? So obviously they built the app, but there was no interconnection layer. The team had to build it themselves. There was no credit scoring system at the time. There's a blacklist. You're either in default or you're not, but there was no nuance into whether or not you're creditworthy or not. And there wasn't a really strong ecosystem of players that would want to lend off someone else's platform. And so you also had to do it all. They started by building their connection layer. They did a Credit Karma style platform after to help people understand their creditworthiness. And then they created an ecosystem to be able to provide an opportunity for lenders to approach consumers and give them an opportunity to monetize. And so that's really this notion of having to build the full stack. And we see that repeated time and time again. If anything, Guilherme is an example of someone that was lucky, right? Because most of the tech that they had to build was in the virtual space. In many other contexts, think of Flipkart, the $18 billion business in India that was sold to Walmart. When I interviewed Binny, one of the co-founders, Binny Bansal, he talked a lot about the infrastructure they had to build, including right from the get-go, having to build their own e-commerce delivery, right? Like imagine if Amazon.com, right when they started launching books, had to also build their own delivery. Amazon.com in the early days scaled and was able to leverage the post office and a lot of these delivery networks. He had to figure out a way to figure out addressing. Not everyone had addresses in the notion that we have, and had to build that out. And so this is kind of this notion of having to build the vertical stack. And I might just, as one quick aside, a lot of these players don't always just build the vertical stack. They often actually build an ecosystem of products, because if you're just offering one thing, like a loan or something like that, often consumers are so underserved that to be able to accept that, they also need a couple of these other things at the same time. And so there's a necessity to actually build an ecosystem in a way that's different than in the Valley, where you might just build one single product and that's it, and just very, very narrow, wedge to the consumer. And so having to do more with less.
Great. Next question comes in, and it's really about how China has really blossomed from not only from a tech perspective, but when you break down the number of unicorns that are now present, I think it's somewhere around 35% up from, we talked about before, 4% that you mentioned in your book. Is there anything that's happening there that is only specific to China and is not relevant for other markets? Or are there a lot of lessons we can take from really what's happened in China over the course of the last 10 years?
Yeah. I think China first is a really great example of one of the ways the innovation playbook is getting adapted and changed for the local ecosystem. And the model there looks different than in the Valley in many ways. And there's a lot of things that are unique to the Chinese ecosystem and what has been built around the super app ecosystem in WeChat, on Tencent, but equally in the Alibaba ecosystem. I think is one great example of something that's totally different that's been built out. I think two, the way corporates and particularly the largest tech companies interact with the startup ecosystem, particularly not just taking the view of investing or buying, but in many ways welcoming them into their ecosystems and helping them scale in that way. So I think there's a lot of things that are unique to the ecosystem, notwithstanding the fact that there is a incredibly large market, a very strategic approach in building it out, and some a variety of factors that have given the opportunity for local players to succeed. So I think there's a lot of things that are unique to it. But what we're also seeing is some of the ideas that are coming out of China being applicable and being replicated elsewhere. And so, for instance, social commerce. One of the companies that we had backed in Fund 1 was Pinduoduo, which is recently scaled to be a $100 billion business. They're about 5 years old around social commerce. There's now replicators in a range of markets around the world, and in particular in emerging markets. And I expect we'll see some in the US. Obviously, we've seen TikTok and its global rise, and including in the US, and out-innovating some of its local competitors, perhaps, but are certainly inspiring a number of local apps here. And so I actually think there's a lot we can learn and a lot we will continue to learn increasingly from what's happening in the Chinese ecosystem. Absolutely.
Great, Alex. And then I think one of the last questions we're going to allow now, and before we wrap up, is number of questions about, if you're an entrepreneur now, what would be your advice to someone who's just getting started, thinking about, building their own company or really kind of taking the dive?
Yeah. And I think today, we're obviously in the eye of the storm right now, and it is an incredibly terrifying time, and for some ways, and my heart goes out to all the entrepreneurs that are managing through this crisis. But also, I think it's an incredible time to be launching a business. For my comments earlier, right? I don't think it's ever been easier to build a startup with a lot of the enabling infrastructure that's existing and continuing to be built. So I think is great. I think, a lot of my students ask me, I want to build a startup. What should I build? How should I think about that decision? I often tell them one thing. I say, look, like, what do you want to do with your life? What's the reason you want to do this? They say, look, I really want to build something and have impact on people's lives. And so I would say, look, take this attitude of being a creator, figuring out a problem where there's a really big gap and that you can help solve it. If you're going to spend the next 10 years of your life focused on building a single product and a single business and a single solution, make sure it's really meaningful. Make sure that you have something that gives you a lot of energy, and at the end of the day, changes a lot of people's lives. And that would be the advice. I think that coming out of COVID, I think COVID has laid bare a lot of these challenges that, frankly, are not new. It's not new that there's 60 million Americans that are unbanked. It's not new that there's 85 million people that have limited or poor access to healthcare. It's not, a lot of these challenges. It's not new that it's hard to do remote work. All these are existing challenges. I think COVID has laid bare that those things exist. I would think about what are some of these big challenges that you can solve that we're now seeing and are exposed to big opportunities. And that would be the advice I would give to budding entrepreneurs that are going to build their next business.
Great. Well, thank you so much, Alex. One last question. Where can people find out more about you and more about Out-Innovate? Yeah,
happily. So you can follow me on Twitter at Alex Lazaro, or sign up to my newsletter at alexlazaro.com. And the book, Out-Innovate, How Global Entrepreneurs from Delhi to Detroit Are Rewriting the Rules of Silicon Valley, is available anywhere where books are sold, including Amazon. Although in the spirit of COVID and supporting small businesses, I'd suggest you buy it from your local bookstore if there's one that you love. But that'd be where you could find the book.
Fantastic. Alex, thank you so much for joining us. I'm going to hand it over to Nabil to wrap up, but I just wanted to say, really enjoyed the conversation today. I hope everyone goes out and buys their Out-Innovate. I found it to be an incredible sort of guidebook on what's happening outside of, you know, Silicon Valley and the bubble that we live in, and is really helpful as truly to think more broadly about innovation and how that's happening in other environments. A lot to take away from it. So thank you again, and Nabil, over to you.
Thank you so much.
Thanks, Alex, and thanks, Clay. And thanks everybody for joining us today. It's a real pleasure to be putting on these programs for the wider audience. And I'd just like to wrap up by mentioning a couple of notes about Terminal, just in case you're not familiar. Terminal brings global opportunities to global talent. We believe in a world where geographical barriers shouldn't exist in terms of getting your dream job. And so we are in the business of offering all kinds of interesting opportunities, principally for software developers and engineers. If you're interested in learning more about any of those opportunities, please just head over to terminal.io/openings. And there you'll see a whole menu of different jobs in different markets that you can potentially apply for. And I'd also just like to wrap up by mentioning that we do these talks every single month, and I'll be emailing everybody that registered after the show with a follow-up email to thank you and to give you some more insight into the next program that we're lining up for you. But with that being said, I want to thank everybody in Mexico, everybody all around the world for joining us today. And with that, it's a wrap. So Eric, you could shut it down on the live stream. Thanks.